Hi everyone, my name is Katie, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the psychoanalytic criticism theory. The psychoanalytic criticism theory was a theory that was developed by Sigmund Freud, and he developed this in the 1880s. He was a neurologist who came across this theory when he was treating patients with behavioral illnesses. Carl Jung was also had some contributions to this theory, but we'll visit him a little bit later. Um, Sigmund Freud, as I said, came across the psychoanalytic criticism theory when he was working with his patients. Um, he realized that some of their behavior was affected by the way they thought, and the way they thought had something to do with their childhood events and even some previous losses, like the loss of a loved one or something like that. Now, some of you, I don't know if you've experienced this before, but you may be saying, well, this doesn't really affect me because I was younger. Well, that leads us into our next thought, that is selective memory. While you may not necessarily remember this, or you may not think that it has something to do with how you behave, that's how he kind of figured out that even though you may not think it does, our brain works in a way that it kind of makes us not realize that it's there, but it's always there in the back of your brain. So even if you don't realize that you're behaving that way, sometimes these experiences from childhood and, as I said, childhood event or a loss can affect how we behave, and that is known as our unconscious behavior. So he kind of experimented with the fact that some of these people were experiencing behavior based on things that they didn't realize they were actually that actually affected them. He also did something with denial, and as I said, some people were like, "No, this didn't happen to me. Like it doesn't affect me that way." And that was another thing. He came across the fact that sometimes these repressed memories actually would creep up, and they would have something to do with their behavior, even though that they may not have realized it or they may not have wanted it to affect their behavior. So they tried to repress it, but when they tried to repress it, it just ended up making them a little bit worse and affecting their behavior a little bit more. Next, we're going to talk about Carl Jung. As I said, he also had some contributions to the psychoanalytic criticism. He was a student of Sigmund Freud, and he contributed by connecting literature to the collective unconscious of the human race. He was kind of interested in how our experiences and how our experience as a whole affected the way we act. And he didn't necessarily focus it on a specific patient, but he was more interested as a whole of how everybody's experiences affected their behavior, and it wasn't just specific on one person. He also kind of came up with the idea that symbols and stories related from myths from our past. As I said earlier, my favorite part about him was this quote down here at the bottom. It says, "Whatever is rejected from the self appears in the world as an event." As I said, this kind of has something to do with Sigmund Freud's concept of denial and how some people try and repress these deep, dark past secrets that they have and the way that they affect their behaviors. That was what he was trying to express in this quote. Whatever is rejected from yourself, whatever you don't think has to do with you, it ends up coming out anyway in the form of behavior. Now, you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with literature? What does this have to do anything with reading or authors or anything like that? Well, Sigmund Freud later came up with, no, he didn't come up with this stuff. So people started to connect the dots between how he explained how people thought and how they can read wow, it's a big word, psychoanalytically, and how they were able to kind of figure out what was going on in the author's mind, and how they could figure out what was going on in the minds of the characters in the books that they were reading. So they were able to kind of figure out how the author would piece together their characters, and they were even able to figure out the psychological state of the author. And over here, I have a picture of Edgar Allan Poe, and we're going to discuss him a little bit more in a minute. Okay, some of the theory's questions that have to do with the psychoanalytical criticism and the theory. How does the narrative relate to the psychoanalytic theory? So this is talking about how do books in general relate to the psychoanalytic theory, and that's a question that people tend to ask themselves when they're reading a book. So how does the narrative, how does the story that somebody's reading relate to the psychoanalytic theory? And that just has to do again with how the characters are developed through their psychological state and through the author's psychological state. The next question is, what does the story show about the author in terms of their psychological state? Um, as I said, this has something to do with the author and how they write their stories based on their own psychological state. Now, in the previous slide, I had a picture of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, one of his most famous poems and stories is A Telltale Heart. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that, but it is a story about how a man is in his house and he keeps hearing heart beating, and he keeps thinking that there is somebody in his house and they're dead and they're under his floor. And it turns out that he actually, Edgar Allan Poe, was a little bit crazy and had some mental illness and was a little bit disturbed. So that has something to do again with the psychoanalytic criticism and how we are able to see in his mind and realize that he is not very mentally stable. And the last question that I have here are there any hidden messages in the narrative? So are there any hidden messages that the author has kind of left there for us to pick up on and to figure out on our own? And that also has something to do with the psychoanalytic criticism in the fact that we have to have the mental awareness enough to pick up on those little hints that the author has left for us. And then this is my works cited. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation on the psychoanalytic criticism theory, and I hope you guys learned a little bit about what this theory is and about the different authors and the scholars that had to do with this theory. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a good day.